In 1955, the name Heinz appeared on Pittsburgh buildings the way other family names appear on currency. Omnipresent, authoritative, and so deeply embedded in daily American life that most residents had long since stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the wallpaper in a room you've lived in for 20 years. The H.J. Heinz Company commanded more than 60% of the American ketchup market. Annual revenues were climbing toward $200 million. Products carrying the Heinz label occupied grocery shelves from Manhattan to Los Angeles, and British families had been purchasing Heinz baked beans since the 1880s, adopting them with the kind of quiet national loyalty that the British extend to a very small number of imported things. At Pittsburgh's North Shore headquarters, the workforce numbered in the thousands. The plant's physical presence along the bank of the Allegheny River, acres of brick and steel with the company's name lit against the Pittsburgh sky, made visible what the brand's supermarket dominance only implied. This was not a company in any ordinary sense. It was an institution, embedded in the daily habits of two countries and the investment expectations of shareholders who had never been near a pickle in a professional capacity. At the head of that institution sat Henry John Jack Heinz II, grandson of the founder, educated at Choate, Yale, and Cambridge. Jack had assumed the company presidency in 1941 at 33 years old, inheriting approximately $100 million in annual sales and a brand recognition that no American food company had matched. He would hold that position for 25 years. During those years, revenues grew past $500 million. The company's geographic reach extended across 5 continents. Jack owned approximately 12 homes and moved through social circles that included British royalty, Greek shipping magnates, and the senior figures of post-war American finance. He did so with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been required to question whether those circles were available to him. His name appeared on the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra's performance hall. Renaissance First, the urban renewal initiative that transformed Pittsburgh's public image from smoke-blackened industrial relic to something modern enough to feature in a postcard, was organized in significant part through his partnership with banker Richard King Mellon. The family's Penn Avenue mansion projected something that wealthy American families in the post-war period worked carefully to communicate. Not merely prosperity. Permanence. The assurance that the dynasty had always been present and fully intended to remain. But here is the thing about dynasties built on names. The name on the label is a promise, and promises, when they are broken often enough, quietly, by people careful enough to manage the noise, leave behind a ledger that no official history ever opens willingly. This is what that ledger actually says. Henry John Heinz, the man who built all of it, had died on May 14, 1919, leaving an estate valued at $4 million, modest by the standards of his Pittsburgh contemporaries Rockefeller and Carnegie and Frick, but substantial in symbolic weight. His public reputation had been built on a single persistently repeated claim, that what you could see through the bottle was exactly what the bottle contained. He championed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. While his competitors hired lobbyists to kill it, he appeared before congressional committees in person to support it. At his North Shore factory, women employees received hot showers, medical care, and weekly manicures, practices so unusual for the era that journalists documented them with barely suppressed astonishment. When his 1875 bankruptcy erased everything he owned, he repaid every creditor in full, including the creditors the law specifically excused him from repaying. His personal notebook, labeled M.O. for moral obligations, listed every name and every figure. Every single one was eventually cleared. That notebook would become the founding myth of everything that followed. It would also, in time, become the sharpest irony in the dynasty's history. Because what his descendants built alongside the fortune was a private ledger of a very different kind. one that no MO notebook was ever opened to record. That ledger begins in 1840 in a Bavarian village with a man named John Henry Heinz boarding a ship for a country he had never seen. John Henry Heinz arrived in America, having sailed from the Bavarian Palatinate, a stretch of vineyard country and river valley in what is now southwestern Germany. He came from Kallstadt, a small village that would later acquire a secondary historical footnote as the ancestral home of the Trump family. He was a bricklayer by trade, a Lutheran by faith, and German by every instinct of culture and daily habit. Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, a working-class community on the Allegheny River a few miles northeast of Pittsburgh, became his home. 3 years after his arrival, in 1843, he was joined by his wife Anna Margareta Schmidt, who had traveled from Hesse-Kassel in central Germany. She brought with her the frugality and religious discipline that the Reformed tradition had been embedding in Hessian households for 2 centuries. Between John's craft and Anna's household management, the family built the kind of stable, earnest, rigorously unsentimental life that immigrant communities in industrial Pennsylvania understood as the achievable American outcome. They did not expect ease. Working, worshiping, raising children, and leaving those children with something more solid than what they had arrived with. That was the entire program. Henry John Heinz was born on October 11, 1844. A slight boy, physically energetic and intellectually alert, he was raised in a home where faith and industry were not competing demands, but expressions of a single underlying commitment. Idleness was not merely unproductive in the Heinz household. It was a form of ingratitude. By the time Henry was 8 years old, he was selling vegetables from his mother's garden to neighbors in Sharpsburg. At 12, he had expanded his plot to 3/4 of an acre growing produce delivered by wheelbarrow to local grocers before school. By 16, he was employing 3 young women to help him manage the volume, paying them from the operation's proceeds and balancing the accounts himself. He learned that presentation mattered. That trust was built through reliability. That customer trust was earned transaction by transaction and surrendered far more quickly than it was built. A lesson that takes most business people years of formal experience to absorb. Henry Heinz had absorbed it by the time he was old enough to shave. His mother Anna shaped his moral formation as deliberately as any institution he would later attend. Her household ran on schedule, obligation, and the conviction that cutting corners was not efficiency but dishonesty dressed up as practicality. Henry absorbed this entirely. His lifelong opposition to alcohol, his obsessive record-keeping, his insistence on repaying debts the law excused him from, all of it traces back to the Hesse-Kassel sensibility that Anna Margareta Schmidt carried across the Atlantic and installed in the Sharpsburg household as uncompromisingly as John installed the bricks in the walls he was paid to build. Now, if you have watched this far, and you understand what kind of man Henry Heinz actually was, what it cost him to build that name, and what it meant to him personally, then you already understand why what happened next to that name, in the hands of the people who inherited it, lands the way it does. Because the same name that meant something so specific to one man can mean something entirely different to the people who profit from it a century later. That gap is exactly what this story is about. And if that kind of gap enrages you, you are in the right place. The first product Henry Heinz sold under his own company's name was horseradish, and the container he chose to sell it in was the most consequential commercial decision he ever made. In the 1860s, commercially prepared horseradish was a product that American consumers had learned to distrust. Manufacturers routinely adulterated it with turnip, wood shavings, and cheaper filler substances that eliminated the product's distinctive heat. Sold in brown ceramic crocks and dark glass bottles, the contents were concealed by design, not by accident. The customer could not see what they were buying because the seller had decided it was better that way. Henry Heinz put his horseradish in clear glass. The decision was simultaneously a commercial strategy and a moral statement. It said, "Look at it." The product he was selling was exactly the product the label described, and he was prepared to prove it by making the container transparent. In a market built on opacity, transparency was genuinely radical. Customers noticed. Grocers noticed. Orders grew. In 1869, he formally co-founded Heinz Noble & Company with his neighbor Clarence Noble. By 1875, the company employed 150 workers at peak season, producing 500 barrels of sauerkraut, 15,000 barrels of pickles, and 50,000 barrels of vinegar annually. Distribution warehouses had been established in Chicago and St. Louis. Henry was 31 years old and genuinely confident that the worst difficulties of building a business from nothing were behind him. The Panic of 1873 had other plans. In 1875, a severe oversupply of horseradish collapsed prices almost overnight. The inventory that had represented the company's accumulated value became worth less than its cost of production. Henry Heinz filed for personal bankruptcy in December of 1875. Assets totaled $110,000. Liabilities had reached $160,000. His parents' furniture was seized by creditors. He was arrested twice on bail. In January of 1876, he stood trial for fraud. His partner Clarence Noble abandoned the company and the friendship with equal finality. His wife Sarah had lost 10 pounds from worry. The bankruptcy was not simply a financial failure in the German Lutheran framework within which Henry lived. It was a moral failure, a failure of the self. What happened immediately after was the act on which everything else in this story was built. Henry Heinz produced a small notebook and began writing down names. He called it the MO Notebook for moral obligations. In it, he listed every creditor he owed, every name, every figure, every amount to the dollar. Pennsylvania bankruptcy law did not require him to repay these debts. The law was prepared to release him from his financial obligations entirely. Henry Heinz decided to treat the legal standard as irrelevant and to hold himself to a different one. Every name in the notebook would be cleared. Because Pennsylvania law prohibited bankrupts from holding formal positions in new enterprises, the reconstituted company was named F&J Heinz for his brother Frederick and his cousin John. His wife Sarah contributed her personal savings and held 50% of the shares. The family pulled $3,000 together. Henry worked within the new company as an employee while repaying the debts the court had excused him from. In 1876, he introduced Heinz tomato ketchup. By 1884, annual sales had reached $381,000. By 1889, they exceeded $1.2 million. In 1888, Henry bought out his partners and renamed the company the H.J. Heinz Company. When it incorporated in 1905 with $4 million in stock value, the balance sheet carried not a single dollar of debt. The 57 varieties slogan arrived in 1896, not from market research, but from an elevated train in New York City. Henry had spotted an advertisement for a shoe store boasting 21 styles, and immediately grasped the commercial effect of a specific number. 57 was his choice because he liked the figure. His wife Sarah's lucky number was 7. His was 5. More than 60 distinct products were already in production when he adopted the slogan. He adopted it regardless. The number was functionally inaccurate and commercially immortal. A manufactured illusion of exactness, presented as a guarantee of what was inside. In that respect, it was perfectly consistent with everything the family would do afterward. But that comes much later. When Henry John Heinz died on May 14, 1919, of pneumonia at his Pittsburgh home, he was 74. His estate distributed $250,000 to the University of Pittsburgh, $300,000 to Sunday school organizations, and the remainder to his 3 surviving children, his daughter Irene, and his sons Howard and Clifford. In dividing his estate among 3 children, he had also, without intending to, created the conditions under which his descendants would spend the next 100 years discovering exactly how far his proposition could be stretched before it snapped. Howard Cavody Heinz assumed the presidency of the H.J. Heinz Company in 1919 and held it for 22 years. A careful steward rather than an empire builder, his contribution was consolidation rather than expansion. During the Great Depression, he introduced Heinz baby food and ready-to-serve soups that proved genuinely well-suited to households with no margin for waste. When Howard died in 1941, his substantial personal estate passed directly to the Howard Heinz Endowment, which would grow into one of Pittsburgh's most consequential charitable institutions. The other branch went west. Henry's 3rd child, Clifford Stanton Heinz, had moved to California in the years following his father's death. Restless and 3 times married, he was a different kind of man from Howard. Less rooted, more peripatetic, and prone to the private difficulties that German Lutheran households preferred not to name directly. Henry's brother Peter had been the first in the extended family to lose himself in alcohol, a pattern that had caused the founder visible private anguish. That struggle did not die with Peter. It moved west with Clifford, recognizable in the 3 marriages, the long hotel stays, the increasing distance from his own children, the isolation that characterized his final years. By early 1935, Clifford was dying of pneumonia in a hotel room in Palm Springs. He was 51 years old. His 3 children from his second marriage, Clifford III, Nancy, and Dorothy, were teenagers and young adults living in Beverly Hills a few hours away by road. They were not told their father was dying. By the time they learned the situation was serious, Clifford was gone. When the will was read, they discovered the reason for the careful management of their notification. Their father had disinherited all 3 of them completely. Every dollar of his substantial estate had been directed elsewhere. The 3 children received nothing. Nancy Heinz Russell, Clifford's daughter, would later state explicitly what she believed had happened. The disinheritance had been arranged on her father's deathbed under direct pressure from the Pittsburgh branch. "They tried to cut us out of the will," she said. "Dad was not a strong, forceful man, and the Heinz family hated my mother. The Eastern family hated the Western family. The lawsuit that followed would run for approximately 50 years. 50 years, generating legal costs, depositions, and court filings across multiple California jurisdictions before arriving at the kind of resolution that prolonged inheritance litigation typically produces. The case ended not in vindication, but in exhaustion. Partial settlements were eventually reached. The California children obtained a share of certain key Heinz trust funds, but only after 5 decades of litigation had consumed enormous resources. Legal fees alone, had they been invested rather than spent, would have made the California Heinzes modestly wealthy in their own right. Clifford's grandchildren growing up in California in the 1960s often had no knowledge that a Pittsburgh branch of the family existed at all. People bearing the same name, living in a city they had never visited, descended from the same man who had sold horseradish in clear glass in 1869, controlling foundations and endowments and concert halls, and a company with hundreds of millions in annual sales. Some of Clifford's great-grandchildren discovered only as teenagers that there was another branch of the Heinz family with whom they shared a surname and no functional relationship of any kind. What Henry Heinz had intended in dividing his estate was continuation, the fortune sustaining the next generation, the family carrying the name forward. Instead, he produced a private war that ran for 50 years, funded by the fortune he had created, conducted through the legal system of a state he had never visited, between grandchildren who shared his blood and had been organized by his wealth into opposing parties. He had not accounted for this in the M.O. notebook. But before we get to the son who would become a senator, There is a matter that the official Heinz history has never willingly examined, and the fact that it has never been examined willingly is itself part of what makes it worth examining. In 1940, something happened in Pittsburgh that required a different kind of management entirely. The details in the public record are deliberately sparse. A woman named Marie Jennings died in Pittsburgh in 1940, in circumstances connected to a member of the Heinz family. That family member was Rust Heinz, a grandson of the founder and a member of the Pittsburgh branch. Precisely what that connection involved has never been explored at length in any official Heinz historical record. What the record preserves is the resolution. The family paid approximately $25,000 to close the matter. In 1940, that figure represented roughly 15 years of median American wages. A substantial sum. Precisely calibrated, the kind of amount that closes a matter without admitting it was ever open. Rust Heinz did not go to prison. No public trial followed. Marie Jennings became a settlement line item rather than a name anyone in the Heinz family was required to remember. Pittsburgh in 1940 was a company town in the specific structural sense. The Heinz plant on the North Shore employed thousands. Pittsburgh's institutional and legal infrastructure was not theoretical to this family. It was operational. When a member of the family required a problem to be managed, the tools for managing it were already in place, already familiar, and already well practiced in the particular discipline of making things disappear before they became things that could not be made to disappear. Howard Heinz, Jack's father, was running the company at the time. His personal reputation rested on civic virtue and institutional generosity. The 1940 incident sat directly beneath that reputation, invisible to it, contained by the same institutional relationships that the reputation had helped build. Neither Howard nor the company ever publicly acknowledged the matter. By 1940, the family had developed a parallel system to Henry's M.O. notebook. Obligations settled not through acknowledgement but through payment. Problems managed not by confronting them, but by pricing them. Henry's obsession with clearing financial debts the law did not require him to repay had mutated in his descendants into its precise inverse, clearing moral debts by the minimum financial means available, with no public record of either the debt or its settlement. Marie Jennings is not commemorated anywhere in Pittsburgh. Her name appears on no Heinz-funded building. The Howard Heinz Endowment, which distributes approximately $40 million annually to worthy causes across western Pennsylvania, maintains no record of her. Priced at $25,000 in 1940, what she was worth in any other sense was not a question the family chose to calculate. Henry John Heinz III grew up in San Francisco, not Pittsburgh. His parents, Jack Heinz and Joan Elijah Deal, divorced in 1942 when the boy was barely 4 years old. Joan moved west with her son and remarried a naval pilot named Clayton McCauley. Jack Heinz, the company president with approximately 12 homes and social obligations ranging from Pittsburgh to London to Athens, was not a present father in any practical sense. Growing up in California, attending schools where nobody paused at the Heinz name the way they would have in Pittsburgh, the boy encountered no expectation of being a particular kind of person because of a label recognized at the grocery store. A roommate at Yale later recalled that no one in San Francisco knew where he came from. He was just Johnny Heinz. He never had the trappings or the attitude of a rich kid. That absence of inherited identity shaped him in ways the fortune could not subsequently undo. Yale came first, with a degree in 1960. Harvard Business School followed in 1963. Service in the Air Force Reserve came next. In 1971, at 32 years old, he ran in the special election for Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District and won with 66.6% of the vote. In 1976, he entered the Republican primary for the United States Senate, narrowly defeating future Senator Arlen Specter. Then, won the general election against Democratic Congressman William Green III, becoming the first Republican ever to carry every ward in the city of Pittsburgh. He was 37 years old. In the Senate, Heinz served on the Finance Committee, the Banking Committee, the Special Committee on Aging, and the Subcommittee on International Finance. He worked across party lines on pension legislation at a time when bipartisan work on anything carried real political cost. Legislation improving drug coverage for elderly Americans, trade policy affecting Pennsylvania's steel industry, environmental regulation that his own party's leadership considered overreach, consumer protection legislation. These were the marks of a politician who had actually read the bills he was voting on. Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado said he really believed he could make the world a better place. His legislative director called him not merely tireless, but joyfully ferocious. Pennsylvania voters returned him to the Senate by substantial margins 3 consecutive times. The kind of senator the country rarely produces and almost never keeps. In 1966, John Heinz married Teresa Maria Tierstein Sims Ferreira. Born in Lourenço Marques in Portuguese Mozambique, she was the daughter of a Portuguese oncologist and a Swiss-German mother. Brilliant, direct, and fluent in 5 languages. Entirely unlike the careful, institutionally calibrated personality that Pittsburgh's civic life tended to reward, she brought to the Heinz name an energy the Pittsburgh branch had never previously demonstrated in public. Their marriage produced 3 sons. John Heinz was the father his own father had not been, present, engaged, known to his children not merely as a name attached to a trust document, but as an actual person they had spent time with. On April 4, 1991, Senator Heinz was scheduled to travel from Philadelphia to Washington, boarding a Beechcraft King Air 100 operated by U.S. Air. At some point during the approach to Philadelphia International Airport, a question arose about whether the landing gear had deployed correctly. A Bell 412 helicopter operated by the Sunoco Corporation was asked to fly alongside and visually inspect the undercarriage. At 4:10 in the afternoon, over Lower Merion Township, southeast of Philadelphia, the Beechcraft and the Sunoco helicopter collided at low altitude above Merion Elementary School. Both aircraft were destroyed. Senator Heinz was killed immediately. His aide Jack Havlicek was killed alongside him. Both pilots were killed. 2 people on the ground, killed when wreckage fell near the school building, brought the total to 6 dead. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the probable cause was the failure of the helicopter crew to maintain adequate separation from the Beechcraft during the gear check maneuver. Contributing factors included deficiencies in coordination between the 2 aircraft and inadequate air traffic control communication. The landing gear had in fact been correctly deployed. The helicopter had been dispatched to verify a situation that required no verification. And in the course of that unnecessary verification, 6 people died on a clear spring afternoon in southeastern Pennsylvania. Henry John Heinz III was 52 years old. Pennsylvania held a special election to fill the vacancy. Harris Wofford, a Democrat, won. The Senate seat the Heinz name had occupied for 15 years was gone within months. Ketchup continued to be sold. Foundations continued to operate. Fortune continued to compound. What did not continue was the single thing that had made the dynasty worth discussing in any arena beyond commercial history, and it fell over a suburban school playground in Lower Merion and did not get up. The estate Teresa Heinz inherited in 1991 was not straightforward to value. Estimates by financial analysts ranged between $500 million and $1 billion. Trusts, foundations, company shares held in various configurations, real estate holdings across multiple states, and the layered philanthropic architecture that Howard and Jack Heinz had assembled over 3 decades comprised the inheritance. At the center of that architecture was the Howard Heinz Endowment, controlling several hundred million in assets and distributing tens of millions annually to arts, education, and environmental causes across western Pennsylvania. Teresa became a central figure in the Heinz family philanthropies and understood what anyone who had paid close attention to how the Pittsburgh branch operated would understand. That philanthropy in this context was not merely charitable impulse. Converting the Heinz name from a commercial brand and a set of private complications into something that felt like culture and civic heritage and institutional prestige required active management. And she brought to that management something the Pittsburgh branch had not previously supplied in such visible quantities: her own personality. Teresa Heinz was not a Pittsburgh cautious person. She established the Heinz Awards, annual prizes for environmental achievement that became among the most respected in their category, and directed substantial funding toward causes that reflected her own convictions rather than the careful political neutrality the Pittsburgh branch had always preferred to maintain. That arena presented itself in 1995 in the form of John Forbes Carey, a Democratic senator from Massachusetts, a decorated Vietnam veteran, and a Yale graduate. He and Teresa were married on May 26, 1995, in Nantucket. Teresa Heinz Carey, the name she adopted publicly while insisting on retaining Heinz, was now the spouse of a sitting Democratic senator. The fortune built by a German immigrant from Bavaria, tended by Pittsburgh Republicans across 3 generations, had been linked through a Nantucket ceremony to the Democratic Party establishment of New England. That complication became fully public during the 2004 presidential election. Carey won the Democratic nomination and faced George W. Bush in November. Teresa Heinz Carey's fortune became an immediate target of Republican political strategy. She did not respond to these pressures with the diplomatic restraint that her husband's campaign advisors consistently urged on her. She told a reporter she believed was misquoting her to shove it. She generated more coverage than several weeks of Carey's policy speeches combined. When asked directly about her estimated $1 billion fortune, she discussed it with the directness she brought to everything, a quality her campaign managers found consistently alarming, and that the national press found consistently good copy. Bush won Ohio by 118,775 votes. He won the presidency. The Heinz money, which 3 generations of careful management had converted from commercial fortune into philanthropic virtue and civic prestige, had been reconverted into a political liability in a single campaign cycle. The announcement arrived on February 14, 2013, Valentine's Day. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and Jorge Paulo Lemon's 3G Capital had agreed to acquire H.J. Heinz Company for $28 billion at $72.50 per share. The financial press described it as the largest acquisition in food industry history. Taken private for the first time since 1948, the company ended 65 years of public trading with a press release. What 3G Capital was bringing to the transaction was not a strategic vision for Ketchup's future. It was a methodology. Zero-based budgeting. The discipline requiring every cost to be justified from a baseline of 0 each year rather than carried forward from the previous year as a default. Applied to beer companies, the approach had made Lehman one of the wealthiest people in Brazil. Heinz was next. Within months of the acquisition closing, the announcements began arriving: significant layoffs, plant closures, cost reduction targets that Heinz's previous management had considered impractical to achieve without damaging the business. Pittsburgh's headquarters, which the city had long regarded as a permanent civic neighbor rather than a corporate tenant subject to relocation, was downsized. Employees who had worked there for decades were let go or moved. The civic institution that Jack Heinz had spent 25 years maintaining as a visible anchor of Pittsburgh identity was being stripped of costs with the systematic efficiency of an organization that regarded sentiment as a balance sheet item requiring justification on its own merits. Buffett described Heinz publicly as the best managed, highest quality, large-scale food company in both the northern and southern hemispheres. That description aged considerably less well than Buffett's reputation. In 2015, Heinz merged with Kraft Foods to create the Kraft Heinz Company, immediately the third largest food and beverage company in the United States and the fifth largest in the world. Various Heinz family trusts remain significant shareholders, but exercise no meaningful operational influence over the entity carrying their name. The merger was announced as a platform for growth. What it created in practice was a platform for applying aggressive cost reductions simultaneously to two large companies, which produced impressive short-term earnings while systematically reducing investment in the brands generating those earnings. Marketing budgets contracted. Research and development spending declined. Capital investment in new products fell below competitive levels. Brands that are underinvested lose shelf space to competitors, which reduces revenue, which creates pressure for further cost reduction, which produces further underinvestment. Describing this cycle is not complicated. Stopping it once the quarterly targets have been built around the savings it generates proved considerably more difficult. On February 21, 2019, Kraft Heinz announced a $15.4 billion write-down on the value of the Kraft and Oscar Mayer brands. The write-down acknowledged formally what had been clear for several years. The cost reduction strategy had destroyed the underlying value it was designed to preserve. Simultaneously, the company disclosed that the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a formal investigation into its accounting practices, focused on how the company had been valuing supplier contracts and procurement relationships. Stock fell 27.46% in a single trading session. Berkshire Hathaway's stake in Kraft Heinz lost roughly $4 billion in market value before trading closed. Buffett subsequently described the Kraft acquisition as a mistake. One of the very few occasions in his public career when he used that word about a major investment. He used it about the company bearing the name of the man who had repaid every creditor from his 1875 bankruptcy, on the strength of a personal conviction that debts are real things requiring honest settlement. The second investigation concluded in September 2021 with a $62 million settlement. Kraft Heinz neither admitted nor denied the agency's findings. Those findings alleged that the company had improperly reduced its reported cost of products sold by manipulating supplier contracts in ways that inflated earnings figures reported to shareholders. In other words, the numbers the company had been reporting to investors were not accurate. Henry Heinz had built his business on a purity guarantee. Putting his name on the label was his warranty, the clearest possible statement that the contents matched the description. The company that purchased his name for $28 billion in February 2013 paid $62 million in September 2021 to settle allegations that its reported numbers did not match reality. Now, here is the thing that most people who encounter this story are not willing to say directly. A man named Henry Heinz built something that had never existed before. From a wheelbarrow and a kitchen garden in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, he built it on a single conviction: that the label and the contents were the same thing. That your name, once placed on something, was a promise you were required to keep, regardless of what the law said about it. He spent years clearing debts the courts had already excused. He did this because he believed a warranty meant what it said. And then he died. And the people who inherited everything he built spent the next century demonstrating exactly how thoroughly a name can be separated from the conviction that made it mean something. A 50-year lawsuit between branches of the same family descended from the same man, funded by the fortune he created. A $25,000 payment in 1940 to close a matter that no official Heinz history ever opened willingly to examine. A sex settlement for $62 million to resolve allegations that the company's reported numbers did not reflect reality. A $15.4 billion write-down, acknowledging that the cost reduction strategy had hollowed out the very brands it was supposed to preserve. None of these ended the fortune. Parts of it still flow through the Heinz family philanthropies. The money proved more durable than any of the people who held it or any of the institutions constructed around it. Ketchup proved more durable still. Kraft Heinz ketchup holds approximately 60% of the American ketchup market more than 150 years after Henry packed the first bottles in clear glass in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania. Ownership has transferred multiple times. The recipe has changed. Family members have had no operational role in the company for decades. None of these changes altered consumer behavior in any measurable way. People continued to buy the ketchup because they had always bought the ketchup, which is the form of commercial immortality that requires the least virtue from the people collecting the proceeds. Heinz Chapel stands on the University of Pittsburgh campus in Oakland. Completed in 1938, it was funded by Henry Heinz as a memorial to his parents, John Henry Heinz and Anna Margareta Schmidt, the bricklayer from Karlstadt and the woman from Hesse Kassel, who had arrived in Sharpsburg in the 1840s and built a life from faith, hard work, and the conviction that obligations are real things requiring honest settlement. The tallest of its stained glass windows rises 62 feet. The building does not know what was done in the name that funded it. Stone does not keep moral accounts. What stands in Oakland is a monument to people who paid their debts, named for a family that learned to pay some of its debts with cash and leave the others on the ledger indefinitely, accumulating with no interest rate attached and no settlement date agreed. Henry John Heinz put his name on the label because he believed the name was a warranty. In 1869 in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, that belief was an act of genuine moral courage, a man declaring that what he sold was exactly what it appeared to be. That transparency was not merely a commercial strategy, but a form of personal accountability that neither a bankruptcy court, nor a business cycle, nor a generation of successors had the power to dissolve. His descendants kept the name. They kept the label. Remarkably, the ketchup also survived. What they could not keep was the thing that made the name mean something in the first place, the conviction that the label and the contents matched, that what you saw was what you got, that a name was a promise rather than a brand. He was right about that. He was simply wrong about which warranty it was. The children who were on the grounds of Marion Elementary School on that clear April afternoon in 1991, who were owed nothing except a normal day, got a different kind of lesson about what powerful names and the institutions built around them actually guarantee. Nancy Heinz Russell, who watched her father die in a hotel room without being summoned, learned hers at a California courthouse over 50 years. Marie Jennings never got the chance to learn anything at all. The M.O. notebook had a last entry somewhere. After the final creditor's name was cleared, it was closed. What it could not record was the ledger that opened immediately after it, the one that is still open, the one with no settlement date and no interest rate and no family elder willing to call it a moral obligation. A man with a wheelbarrow of horseradish and a clear glass bottle built the most recognized condiment brand in American history on the proposition that transparency is accountability, that you put your name on it because you mean it. You already know whether the people who inherited that name meant it. You knew before you got to this sentence. If you are the kind of person who thinks the distance between what someone says they stand for and what they actually do when the costs are real is the most important thing worth paying attention to in any institution, any dynasty, any name on a label, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe, because that gap in business, in politics, in history, in the families that shape both, is exactly what we keep coming back to examine. The fortune survived. The name survived. The ketchup survived. 150 years, and it is still on your table. What Henry Heinz could not pass down, it turns out, was the only thing that made any of the rest of it worth having.